Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Schaus coming to you live from Washington, D.C., and thanks for joining us today in our Webinar Wednesday series. We host webinars every Wednesday, and these are complimentary and recorded. You can find all of the recordings on our YouTube channel as well as our website, and the full schedule is also on our website. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, so if you have questions today for our speaker, who is Anne Laurent. Her contact information will be on the last slide, and you can contact her directly. A little bit about us. We do provide professional services for federal contractors. This includes product companies, software companies, professional services companies. Some of our services are listed there on the screen in front of you. Some upcoming events. We are conducting a teaming and partnering class on October 24th. And then in December, we have our 4th annual Doing Business with DoD and the Intel community. Registration links are also found on our website under the events section. If you're interested in advertising in our newsletter, which goes out every Monday at 11 o'clock, it hits about 15,000 plus subscribers. That includes government and government contractors. You can contact us for pricing using that email address on your screen. Okay, our speaker today is Anne Laurent. Her background information is here. And she's going to be talking about category management, supercharged market intelligence. It's a hot topic, and Anna, without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Welcome here from the steamy Washington, D.C. area. Let's have the next slide, if you don't mind. So I'm here to talk to you about market and supplier intelligence now, what I call supercharged market and supplier intelligence. So to differentiate from regular market research that's performed under the Federal Acquisition Regulation, I thought I'd put together this slide. So you know that under the FAR, we are supposed to do market research. And by the by, that's supposed to be done by program folk with the assistance of procurement folk. So if we're not doing that in our programs, we have a problem, and we should be pushing harder. At least for market research, which usually consists of requests for information, industry days. You know, we yank out the past contract often and take a look at that. We get to do vendor one-on-ones periodically when they present themselves. We certainly talk to our colleagues. We usually run a Google search, right? We look at the CPARs of existing suppliers. We might do some social media looking around. Often we receive catalogs and source lists from suppliers, and we do have certainly PDS and elsewhere where we can look at sources of government information about suppliers. But that's pretty much it. And what you don't see there is a tremendous amount of curiosity about how the markets function from which we buy. Or tremendous depth, actually, on the suppliers either, if you think about it. Mostly what we're doing is asking the markets and suppliers to respond to the government and the way that the government does things. And category management, as I noted in a previous webinar, is market-facing. That is to say, it turns its attention away from the customer of the market to the market itself and to the suppliers therein. So government has to get out of its own, focus on its own belly button, if you were, on FAR procedures and contracting regulations and rules, and learn the markets from which it buys and the suppliers within those markets. In order to do that, category management requires a continuous process of market and supplier intelligence gathering and analysis. What's that look like? Well, that kind of intelligence includes all the things in these two boxes. It's quite broad, it's quite comprehensive. It includes understanding within any given market that we buy from what supply and demand look like, what's the competitive landscape, who are the better suppliers, who are the new suppliers coming in, what kind of market disruption might be occurring. That is to say, someone who figures out in the hospitality industry how to provide space in people's homes as opposed to just in hotels. You might recognize that as Airbnb. If there's a market disruptor around these days, it would be Airbnb, for example, to the hotel industry. We look at financial performance, we look at now more and more increasingly, we look at issues around sustainability, which companies are practicing good hygiene and sustainability, which ones aren't. We look at the number of buyers and suppliers. We look at alternate products that might be entering into existence that we might want to change from one market to another in order to acquire. All sorts of intelligence is being monitored constantly under the market supplier intelligence for category management. Next slide, please. So essentially what we're looking for is an understanding of what's happening in the marketplace that enables our category management teams to manage the suppliers and to manage us. In other words, to manage the buyers. Again, this is talking about our focus on managing requirements and demand in such a way that enables us to buy more effectively in markets from suppliers, particularly of common goods and services, which is what our program here in the United States and most government programs are focused on. So we need to know who are buying, who's buying within our organizations, within our government, who are the key suppliers in the market. We're looking at disruption, we're looking at innovation, mergers, acquisitions. What determines price increases and price falls? That is to say, what drives cost in the market? All of these are issues that we're trying to get at through this kind of supplier and market intelligence. Next slide, please. Today I want to talk to you specifically about the way that the Air Force practices category management business intelligence. The Air Force is a leader in the Department of Defense in practicing category management. It began doing that about the same time as Ann Rung, then the OFPP administrator, announced that the entire federal government was going to begin practicing category management. However, the Air Force has adopted a much more industry-like approach to category management than has the entire government program. The government-wide program is essentially focused on contract consolidation, reducing transaction costs by focusing spending through fewer contract vehicles. You've heard of the best-in-class contracts. That is a key element of that program, whereas the Air Force is using a more industry-like model. It's not limited just to looking at strategic contracts, but it also employs industry best practices, demand management, policy change to reduce costs, and a heavy focus on mission capability and driving cost out from mission support operations to be able to drive more spending, more funding to mission-focused activities. So what does that look like in terms of business intelligence? Comprehensive study of commercial practices within a market. Again, what the Air Force is focused on is rate, that is unit prices, process, things that are in the way of better buying, whether that be Air Force policies, whether that be government-wide policies, whether that be overhead, all of that. Inefficiencies, in other words, that need to be solved. And demand. How do you save the most money? Well, you save the most money by not buying something at all if it's not needed, or if you've been buying it inefficiently, or if you could share it rather than buy it, or if it just is sitting on the shelf for lack of knowledge of how to use it, etc. And all of those things exist in our market. It's comprehensive, as I said. It leads to a better understanding of requirement, which makes government a better consumer. We focus on business intelligence in order to understand how other buyers buy what we buy, so that we can better understand what it is that we need to require, how we need to buy it, and that makes us better buyers. And it's the collection, integration, and analysis, then presentation to category teams and to buyers of business information so that they can use it to become better buyers. Next slide. So, okay, so Air Force has a collect, integrate, analyze, and present model. which is what I was talking about before. This just goes a little bit deeper into what that is. Who, what, when, where, how, and why is the kind of data that we're gathering, that the Air Force is gathering about its spending, all right? They're then integrating that data, looking for commonalities, coming up with that TCO. What is that total cost of ownership? And identifying the gaps between the way that others are buying and the way that Air Force is buying, then doing further research on that in order to deliver that business intelligence to decision makers in a data-driven manner. Next slide, please. So this is directly from the Air Force. This is that process that I've been trying to talk about. It's kind of an odd little diagram, but I think it's actually useful in letting you sort of get inside of what business and supplier intelligence really looks like for the Air Force, and then how it plays into category management. So what we're talking about is the spend analysis process that starts every category management process in the world. Identifying the targets of opportunity within category spend, that is to say, identifying which areas of spending to focus on in order to get the biggest return on investment in category management, okay? It's a very important process that the Air Force has spent considerable time developing a tool to help them to identify those high ROI areas of spend. Then analysis of requirements, collection of actionable business intelligence, benchmarking with industry, and to find cost and performance gaps between the way that buying is done and managed in industry versus the way that we're now, or the Air Force is now doing it. So if you look over here on the right, you can see that we start out on the category strategic plan side. Okay, how are we doing that? Well, you know, we've got to do that spend analysis we talked about. We go to look to the wheel and we do analysis of our own subject matter expert data, right? Then we do analysis of the market. Then we do benchmarking against other buyers like ourselves, right? And identify gaps in what they're spending versus what we're spending, in their practices versus what Air Force's practices are, and develop a set of course of actions. That involves all the wheel that you see up there. Interviews within the Air Force to better understand the spend and the requirements that are causing that spend. Industry research, which I will get to further on, where the Air Force actually has a contract with a large supplier of business intelligence across industries across the world, right? And they have made that subscription open to everybody in the Air Force to go out and look at what's going on in the markets and with the suppliers in any given category of spending. Interview similar customers, both within government and outside government, to find out, hey, how are other people buying this? Are we getting the prices they're getting? Are our practices similar to their practices? If they're getting better prices than we're getting? All of that. We're looking at Air Force common output level standards. For example, for integrated solid waste management, the Air Force for a long time was requiring that its waste receptacles on facilities be no more than 80% full. So it was requiring people, the garbage haulers, essentially, that were working there to get out of their trucks and check and see what was inside of those waste receptacles. Nobody else in industry does that. So the Air Force realized that it was adding both cost and a safety issue because the drivers were having to get in and out of their vehicles. Okay, so what happens? You got to change, in this case, your own common output level standards, i.e., your specifications, as it were, to the level of industry, not to just making it up yourself. You've got activity management plans that you need to look at, both the data that have come from that's AMP, and also sort of how you're managing the activities within a given category. You have to talk to your service providers and your suppliers to find out, well, hey, what are the incentives that you're accustomed to so that we can begin to use those levers ourselves. Again, you talk with your own SMEs and you take data and information from the contracting process itself. You do all of that. You take all of that data in, you take all of that intelligence in, and you present it in a category intelligence report. These things are usually very thick and very thorough. Because why? Because we're trying to develop courses of action to present to decision makers in the Air Force. To say, okay, what courses of action would be best in managing this category? Should we manage demand, focus on that? Should we change or issue new policies? Should we do strategic sourcing? Should we do contracts differently? Should we adopt industry best practices? What should we do? So that's sort of a look at the inside of the process. Next slide, please. So I was telling you about industry-wide information sources. This is Procurement IQ on the left-hand side. This is something that's produced by IBISWorld, right? And this is what I told you that the Air Force has an Air Force-wide subscription to. The reason is because that knowledge and expertise that is presented in there lets them make smarter decisions about market trends, about benchmarking their data, cost drivers, and supply chain within the markets that they're buying from. And you can get, you know, thousands and thousands of reports on every different industry that you might be interested in. Here, as you see, I was just talking about, here's solid waste collection and disposal services. You know, you find out very quickly that here, before the ISWM category was being managed by the Air Force, they're paying considerably more per ton than was industry. I believe it was something like $136 for the Air Force and $119 per ton, I think. And that's a big difference. And a lot of savings could be located there. Next slide. IBISWorld is obviously not the only source of this kind of information. On the left-hand side here, there's a handful of the other kinds of firms that exist, only to show you that there's lots of information available. If you want to really do supercharged market and supplier intelligence, there is no lack of information available to you and available to people across your agency on the program side and on the procurement side if you want to subscribe to these. On the right-hand side is a look at the kind of information that you can get. This is about netbooks, which we don't talk about much, but I thought it was an interesting presentation of information, comprehensive information about the netbook market, showing you the size and volume and growth in that market, what drives the demand for was driving the demand for netbooks when this was studied, key trends in that market, strengths in that market, who the original design manufacturers are, who are very important in this particular market, and what the cost structure is, what is driving the cost that we're paying for this particular kind of hardware. Raw materials, obviously, is the biggest one. Next slide, please. So we look further at the whole netbook world, right? And here we're looking at more about the supply chain itself. And to understand the supply chain is to understand where the points of risk are. Government is becoming more and more adept at this as we begin to realize that particularly in computer or IT hardware and software, we have tremendous vulnerabilities because our hardware relies on integral supply chain parts and pieces that are manufactured by other countries, particularly other countries that we consider adversaries, such as China. So this is something that we've started to get interested in, but I think that it's important to also be interested in other aspects, broader aspects of that supply chain. Because within the supply chain, you see that manufacturers who are making components of these various different kinds of products are also sometimes at risk. What kind of risk? Could be reputational risk, could be natural disaster risk, could be all kinds of different risks that will have an effect on the government as a purchaser. So I have a little arrow showing you Western Digital there. If you'll go to the next slide, please. So here's an example. In 2011, you might recall there were terrible monsoons in Thailand, right? That caused the worst flooding in 50 years, but it also destroyed nearly a third of the hard disk manufacturing capacity worldwide. Well, that becomes interesting, particularly to the government, because Western Digital, that I was talking about on the previous slide, is a supplier to HP, which was the government's number 6 IT supplier, and Dell, number 21 supplier, both in 2015. Western Digital got hit really hard. If you look up on the right-hand side of the map there, you'll see in the key that Western Digital was in one of the areas of highest flooding during those monsoons. Well, they were hard hit. So was the whole global computer production market. And those shortages and price fluctuations that were caused affected the federal market. Knowing this kind of information would help us buy better, right? Would help us seek out different suppliers who have in their supply chain suppliers from different parts of the world so that we can hedge against this kind of natural disaster risk. Next slide, please. So let's take an example from the Air Force itself and see how some of this plays out. The Air Force decided a few years ago that it needed to take a look at fire protection suits. So the suits that firefighters wear. You might not think that firefighting is a key MOS, as it were, for the Air Force. But if you think for about 5 minutes, you realize the Air Force operates lots and lots of airfields and lots of aircraft. And in fact, firefighting is a very, very important capability that the Air Force must possess. And what they discovered was that their firefighters were using fire protection suits that were made up of elements from very different manufacturers: boots, helmets, gloves, and the actual suits themselves. That produced inefficiencies. First of all, if you have parts from different suppliers, you have to train on how those different parts are supposed to work. That's more training required, more possibility for error in using those parts because of that increased need for training. They also discovered that mismatched pieces that they were using were leaving firefighters' skin exposed to chemicals and to burns. Chemicals can burn you just by being chemicals, and burns obviously are fire-related burns. So this was causing a safety problem as much as anything that the Air Force set out to correct. What they learned in doing the kind of intelligence gathering that I've been talking about is that they were failing, for one thing, they were failing to aggregate demand. They were paying much higher prices than other customers of size for their suits, in part because they were basing their order on per base needs. They weren't aggregating their need. Their full need was for 5,000 suits or ensembles every year to cover the 10,500 firefighters Air Force wide. So in other words, they were replacing 5,000 of those things every year. Next slide, please. So how did they discover that they were paying too much? They benchmarked, and they benchmarked in this case against the New York and California fire departments. Okay, the state fire department in one case, the city in the other, and discovered, immediately, hey, they buy standard suits. Okay, so no mismatch of parts, way fewer vendors, less training required, right? So Air Force said, oh, okay, so what we're going to do here is follow suit. We're going to narrow our requirements. They ended up reducing contract line items from 109 to 14, and the number of contracts for these ensembles, these suits, from 14 to 9. And there they are, right there. They had 1 for boots, 5 for ensemble pieces, 3 for suit care and support. You actually had to maintain these things and over time. And for just one fiscal year, last fiscal year, that resulted in savings of $1 million. Now, the Air Force, having learned from its market research, issued a directive that made these contracts mandatory contracts across the Air Force. That's going to increase their savings. And the big point is that that's going to increase the amount of funding thereby available to buy better, more protective suits and to cover that need better, and to also shift some of that spending to other readiness requirements, because like all of the services, the Air Force is right now looking very, very hard for funding that it can use for modernization and readiness. And that funding isn't going to come from larger and larger and larger appropriations, even though the appropriations recently have been larger for the Defense Department. In all, they have not been large enough to fund both the cost of the estate of common spending across the Defense Department as it exists, operations and maintenance funding, and to cover readiness and modernization. So they've got to find ways to reduce that O&M spending and move money into actually critical readiness requirements. And this is one way of accomplishing that. Next slide, please. So what do we know? We know that this kind of supercharged market and supplier intelligence helps us identify new, innovative substitute products and services. That is particularly important right now, as especially the Defense Department is trying to infuse innovation by bringing new kinds of suppliers, startups, emerging suppliers, Silicon Valley, astonishing new capabilities into the defense and federal market. One of the best ways of doing that in areas where you are managing categories of spend is to do this kind of supplier and market intelligence continuously. You will see disruptive capabilities entering the market. You will see the new companies entering the market because you will be constantly focused on gathering intelligence about those markets and their suppliers. And when some new crazy thing moves into the market, like Airbnb, it won't be a shock, and you'll be able to actually leverage that information in order to make smarter purchases. And category management doesn't have to be exclusively the domain of commonly purchased goods and services either. So you can use it for managing your bespoke specialized requirements as well, per agency, per department, per military service. And that's one of the ways that we can answer the call for innovation without having to create bespoke new ways of going out and finding innovation in the market. This kind of intelligence can also help increase and widen competition by virtue of the same phenomena. If you know more about the market that you're buying from, you're watching the supply base, you're able to see incoming new suppliers. You're also better able to manage suppliers up from being base level okay suppliers to being superlative suppliers by working with them using the methods by which that market incentivizes companies in order to get them to adopt practices to become better suppliers for the government. Also informs you of potential additional value that you can get if the market that you're buying from has a pattern of negotiating contracts where the price for the given service or product goes down over time, then you can take advantage of that as a government buyer, as a government category team as well. All of that information is available to you if you are performing intelligence gathering at this level. Also helps you construct the most appropriate procurement vehicles and conduct the best contract and supplier management, because you're looking at the way that it's done in those markets and taking advantage of those trends and those practices that already exist in those markets, that those suppliers are familiar with and that they are responsive to for other customers. And also, as we've said, it helps you identify and manage risk, which is growing in importance, particularly, for example, climate-based risk of natural disasters. More natural disasters and more severe natural disasters are coming every year, and this appears to be worsening for the future. Figuring out the supply chain and the vulnerabilities of the suppliers that you are buying from becomes a very, very important risk management technique. And that's just talking about one source of risk. Price volatility is another one. Agricultural production for foodstuffs, for example, and also for the inputs to fuel and other things, very important areas of risk. All of these you can manage better and be smarter about and hedge against if you're doing this kind of market and supplier intelligence. Next slide. So market and supplier intelligence are vitally important. I touch upon them in a recent report was published by the IBM Center for the Business of Government in February called Buying as One, Category Management Lessons from the United Kingdom. You'll read some of the examples of how the United Kingdom has employed this kind of market intelligence. And I will tell you that there are a couple of pieces coming out soon on Federal News Network, written pieces, columns about the actual Air Force program itself. So you might want to watch for those as well. They were co-written by Tim Cook from ASI Government and myself. So to watch for those coming ahead. I think that you'll be seeing more and more about the Air Force category management program in the future. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for a great presentation. Lots of valuable information. Category management is obviously something that is valuable to contractors as well as government itself. So if anybody has any questions about anything that she presented today, Anne's contact information is here. It includes her email address and her phone number. This session has been recorded, so if you want to go back and listen to any parts of it, we'll have the recording by the end of the week on our website and on our YouTube channel. Thanks again, everyone who joined us, and thanks again, Anne, for great presentations today. I really enjoyed them.
Thank you too, Jennifer. Thanks very, very much for the opportunity, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.